Thank you so much, Jeff. It is great to be with everybody. I'm coming to you live, and it is a real treat to be able to do that. I pity the panel as they will have to discuss live without having any chance to review, so give them some grace. I want to talk for a few moments about developing and deploying homegrown disciples. There's a passage in Acts chapter 8, starting in verse 1, and it says this. It says, "On that day, a great persecution broke out against the church in Jerusalem, and all, except the apostles, were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria." If you jump down to verse 4, it says what they did as they scattered. It says that those who had been scattered preached the word wherever they went. If you fast forward to Acts chapter 11, we discover that these ordinary, unnamed, they were so unremarkable they didn't even get their names in Scripture, disciples, scattered to cities, and were the very first people to make disciples among the Gentiles and plant churches there. This story is so powerful that it's easy to miss for its simplicity. The first church planters were simply ordinary disciples without any special training that had an encounter with Jesus, and wherever they went, they made more disciples. This simple passage led us as a church, Lift Church, to consider a fairly simple idea. What if the pattern that we saw in Acts 8 and 11 was intended to be a normative strategy for church planting? As a church, we had grown into a relatively successful church, around 500 people, mostly in their 20s. We were young, we were hip, we were attractive. But when we started to desire and started to experiment with church planting, it became immediately apparent that we could not reproduce our format in new locations without considerable resources. But more importantly, we came to see that what we really had in our inability to reproduce was an endemic discipleship issue. The ability to gather and the ability to develop and deploy disciples are two completely different skills. And importantly, it's the latter, discipleship, that we are commanded to do. So about 5 years ago, we asked, what if we committed to a way of thinking about church where our sole goal was to raise and deploy disciples? What if our goal was so that anyone in our church, if they were to be moved to a new city, and we came back in a number of years, say 5 or 10 years, as a result of their faithfulness, we would see a church there? Well, this is the story now of my friend Ina. Ina joined our church about 7 years ago as a Muslim. She came to know Jesus, she came to love Jesus, she came to love Jesus' church, and she came to love Jesus' mission. We discipled Ina, we trained Ina, and then one day Ina came and she said, "I want to move to Toronto." We're in Hamilton. It's about an hour away. And so with no seminary training, no background in church leadership, we sent Ina to plant a church in Toronto. We raised $0 to support her. She had to get a job. She is now a real estate agent. You fast forward 3 years, including a global pandemic, and today, as a result of Ina's faithfulness, there is a thriving church in Toronto that is reproducing disciples amongst people that have never heard the gospel. This is how we now plant churches. We simply evangelize, disciple, and then send people to go and start the same simple process of evangelism and discipleship in a new city with new people. There's no pressure to gather. There's no pressure to perform. We give them the time and the space to do what the disciples in Acts chapter 8 did. Now, of course, we come alongside, we resource it. If they need facilities and it grows, wonderful. We'll do whatever it takes to support it. What we have here is not a model. I really want us to get this kind of thinking right. You can't copy and paste what we are doing at Lift Church into a new context and expect it to work. Instead of a model, we have a number of values. And values are transcultural. Too often, we want to look at disciple making and deploying church planters from a model or program approach. And this is problematic because models and programs aren't flexible enough to transfer into new contexts. But if we start with values, they shape the way that we think and the way that we live. But if we're going to implement values, especially as leaders, it's not enough for us to implement the values organizationally. We need to start by internalizing the values of discipleship personally in our own lives and in our own homes. In short, if we want to be a church that is developing and deploying church planters, then we need to start as leaders by being personally, deeply, passionately committed to disciple making. The future of church planting needs to shed our obsession with finding the next quick fix model, and we must learn to steward and cherish what we see in the scriptures. And so in the remaining time, I want to share 3 values that are shaping our thinking that I believe may bless you. The first value is very simply the priesthood of all believers. You know, that ancient relic of theology that sort of started the Reformation. I don't think that as a church in the West that we have mined it for its beauty. Martin Luther wrote 500 years ago, he said, "A cobbler, a smith, a farmer, each one has the work and office of his trade, and yet they are all alike. Consecrated priests and bishops, and everyone by means of his own work or office must benefit and serve every other." Do we really believe that everyone who is a follower of Jesus is called to make disciples? If we're going to be serious about deploying disciples, we need to be serious about the word everyone. Now, don't hear me wrong. I'm not saying that character and proven track record and competence don't matter, but that our framework needs to be broad to see the potential in every believer. And that works out in 3 ways. Number 1, if we value everyone called to discipleship, everyone needs to be called to the mission and equipped and sent on that mission. This means that we must shed our desire for control and instead deploy every person for the work of discipleship. As Jesus does in Matthew 10, he takes the young disciples that have no idea what they're doing and he gives them power and authority. Our church is made up of about 40 some odd, we call them simple churches, that are broken into regions across 6 cities. And every simple church leader has the mandate to lead their simple church however they best see fit. They're empowered. And the one point of accountability is to raise up disciples to one day see them launch out a new simple church. It's messy, and especially as a senior leader, tremendously challenging because we can't control it. We need to release it. The second aspect of this priesthood of all believers is we need to embrace co-vocational ministry as the norm. Every single one of our church planters is co-vocational. Amongst our church planters, we have a PhD student, a massage therapist, a firefighter, a social worker, a real estate agent, and a chemical engineer, among others. But all of them have pursued their careers, taken jobs, and even rejected promotions so that they can make disciples. Their primary calling as they see it is the work of disciple making. Everything else, including their careers, is secondary. Let me say that again. 100% of our church planters are either full-time employed or co-vocationally employed. And we won't even consider someone to plant a new region unless they have some kind of work. And this comes from my own story. I worked co-vocationally as a software developer leading our church for almost a decade. I didn't see my role in our church provide a dime of income for our family for the first 8 years of our leadership. And it wasn't until we were operating on multiple cities and working on our fourth church plant that we finally said maybe we should give a little bit more time to this. And this is important. I want to highlight this. Our biggest critics were actually pastors. If you are co-vocational, what you are doing is valid, legitimate, and the future. And we as the church need to celebrate and champion people, not ask them, when are they going to finally quit their jobs? We need to normalize co-vocational ministry. The third aspect of doing this, priesthood of all believers, means that we need to challenge the idols of comfort, consumerism, and careerism. In many cases, we have muddied the waters on discipleship and vocation, and we have allowed discipleship to become a secondary aspect of calling while attaching it to a primary vocation in our careers. Simultaneously, we have normalized a standard of living in Christians that requires dual income, high debt, and no time for ministry. If we are going to deploy people to be co-vocational, we need to challenge the assumptions that we can have a normal Western life while doing so. Let me say that again. If we want to raise a generation of disciple makers, we must confront the idols of consumerism, comfort, and career. Disciple making is costly. And all of our leaders have had to pay that price. And the fruit that they are seeing as they do so is tremendously beautiful. Which leads me to the second value. If we want to develop and deploy disciple makers, we need to view the church as a missional family. Said another way, we need to have a clear value about what it means to be the church. The invitation to church as family, this is a kind of a complicated one. It is far more beautiful than simply the creation of a community group that has strong affinity for one another. In my early years of leadership, I was really hesitant to embrace the teaching of church as family because I was concerned that it would result in our church functioning as like a social clique or becoming insular. That we become self-obsessed and even narcissistic because we just loved each other so much. What about the thousands of people that didn't have access to the gospel? What if we were just so obsessed with ourselves and our family that we didn't have time for the lost? But eventually I came to realize that the true answer to my quandary was not less family, but more of it. Much of my hesitancy was rooted in the observation that the Western family unit, the nuclear family unit, operates as an extension of our individualistic tendencies. Yet the picture of family painted in the New Testament is a product of a strong community-oriented thinking, not individualistic thinking. Said another way, I came to see that the sentness of the church, the fact that the church is sent to the nations, was intertwined with the togetherness, the impulse to gather the church. Just as discipleship itself requires reproduction and multiplication alongside sanctification and personal growth in Christ, the more the church grows to love one another, the more it will multiply and reproduce. This is so important. Without comparison, the dominant metaphor or picture of the church in the New Testament is that of family. Every book in the New Testament contains this language. Romans, Corinthians, doesn't matter where you go. Paul's letters, Peter, John, family. You see, how do we work together to form viral, I don't know if I'm allowed to say that, to form, Alan did, so I guess I can, viral movements of disciple making and Jesus communities if we don't have a clear picture of the end destination to which we are headed? And the end destination in the scriptures is that of a family united together as brothers and sisters at the throne of our glorious King. You see, this forced for family is essential because if we want to develop and deploy disciples, we need to cultivate togetherness and sentness. We need to bond together. Many of the people that we have led to Jesus came to Jesus from backgrounds that required them to be rejected by their families, whether it's Muslim, Hindu, Sikh. I have housed many people in my home, prayed with them as they have been rejected by their families. If the church wants to be expansive in its discipleship, we need to paint a picture of what we are inviting people into. When it comes to deploying disciples into new contexts, this means that we are deploying family members, not employees. If we are going to deploy disciples, it means we are deploying disciples, not staff. Too often, our relationships in the church are primarily contractual, defined by terms of a mutually beneficial agreement that is bound in time and place. You will find no picture like that in the New Testament. In our church, we value togetherness and we value deployment. It means our homes, our finances, the way we raise our children, the way we share our possessions are intertwined. Now, it's easy to dismiss this at first blush as saying, well, you're naive and idealistic. Make no mistake, over the last 15 years of leading this, we have had tremendous conflict. And it has been very hard at times. But what we have learned is that the more that we lean into family and loving one another, the better equipped we are to deploy our disciples because of our capacity to truly know and love them. Of course, it's still difficult. But the call to love one another as family must prevail. Which leads me to my third thought on church as missional family. It's simply this: that the Acts 2 church is a workable model for discipleship and deployment. The Acts 2 church of the believers having everything together, it works and we can depend on it. The development of disciples cannot be placed inside a program. It needs to serve the needs of the family. This leads me to my final value. Simply this: church planting is the overflow of Spirit-empowered discipleship and evangelism. Church planting is the overflow of Spirit-empowered discipleship and evangelism. If we want to think about deploying disciples to plant churches, we need to go back to the question of what is church planting. And in the New Testament churches were the overflow or the result of faithful evangelism and discipleship. Nobody set out to plant a church. They set out to make disciples. And when we are faithful with disciple making, we will see churches thrive. If we want to deploy our disciples, we need to stop and ask the question, what are we deploying them for? And too often we think about it as a destination that involves an event on a Sunday, preaching and worship. When we think about church planting or discipleship deployment from an event-driven framework, it often leads the process. But the church is what happens when we are faithful with evangelism and disciple making. You know, historically in the past, we could plant a church and have a reasonable chance at survival by attracting disaffected Christians or straight up just stealing sheep from other churches. Those days are over. The days of the church being hardwired for attracting people and just having them come are over. In our postmodern, post-Christian, post-pandemic, post-the world making sense to any of us, we need to return to the biblical basics about the identity of the church. The identity of the church in the New Testament is that it is the overflow or the result of evangelism and disciple making. And this is liberating because it means the very thing we do to get churches off the ground, making disciples and evangelism, we can keep doing over and over and over again. This means that every person becomes a prospective church planter because every person is a disciple who called to make disciples. A number of years ago, I was praying, Lord, send us some church planters. We want to plant some churches. I couldn't find anyone. No one was emailing me saying, Robin, I want to plant a church. I was praying, Lord, what do I do? Send us the people. And the Lord said, Robin, quite clearly I can remember it. I've already given them to you. Stop praying for workers and start using the workers I have already sent. So rather than seeking people outside, we began to invest in those we had, and we could never imagine the leaders that would step up. We began to develop a discipleship process where our goal was that every person who was discipled would reproduce disciples, and that anyone who was sent would be able to plant a church. The goal is to take someone like Ina with no knowledge of Jesus to a deployed church planter in 4 years. This is so important. Our discipleship process cannot merely include internal transformation. Our discipleship process needs to include activation towards discipleship multiplication from the beginning. In the last 3 years, even over the pandemic, we have launched churches in 5 new cities. And yet none of our church planters have formal training. None of them are particularly good at public speaking, but all of them love Jesus and have a track record of fruitful disciple making. All of them are co-vocational. All of them love their church family. All of our disciples have been sent to new cities with a simple mandate: tell people the good news and make disciples. And everything we do supports them towards that end. Let me put it very simply. If we have a holistic picture of disciple making that includes internal transformation and a compelling call to disciple making multiplication, we will inevitably end up planting churches. If we have or are struggling to find people to plant churches, we have a discipleship and evangelism problem, not a church planting problem. The church planters and the disciple makers are already in our churches. They're just waiting for permission, encouragement, and a call to say, go the same way Jesus did. And that's my encouragement to us as a Congress, to take the call that Jesus has given us to make disciples of all nations and to shout it again, louder and more impassioned, because people need to know the God that has made them, the God that loves them.